A deadly ambush, a brave officer bleeding out, and his loyal K-9 German shepherd, Max, standing firm in the face of danger. No backup, no way to call for help, just one dog's unshakable determination. What Max did next wasn't just loyalty. It was a miracle that would forever be remembered by the entire force. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves inspiring stories, and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching this from? The figure staggered back as Max's teeth snapped just inches from his arm, the K-9's growl echoing through the alley like thunder. The sudden movement caused Ethan's heart to race even faster, his pulse pounding in his ears. He kept his weapon aimed at the figure, trying to assess the threat. Max circled the man, his eyes locked onto him, every muscle in his body poised to strike at a moment's notice. "Drop the weapon," Ethan ordered, his voice low but firm. The hooded figure hesitated, their breath shallow and ragged. The weapon, a glinting knife, was clutched tightly in their hand, but the figure seemed unsure whether to comply or flee. Ethan's fingers tightened around his weapon, the weight of the decision hanging heavy. "Last chance," Ethan barked. Max moved in closer, his growl rising in volume, a sound filled with authority and raw power. The figure's eyes darted nervously between Ethan and the dog, but instead of dropping the knife, they made a sudden move, darting toward the shadows at the far end of the alley. "No!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. The figure was already moving with startling speed, their footsteps slapping against the wet pavement. Max's reaction was instantaneous. He lunged after the figure, his body propelled by years of training. Ethan's finger was already squeezing the trigger when he saw the figure's sudden shift. But before he could pull the shot, Max was on them. The sound of teeth sinking into flesh was sickening, followed by a sharp cry of pain. The knife fell to the ground with a clatter, the figure's body slamming into the alley wall as Max held them down with a powerful grip. Ethan rushed forward, holstering his weapon and grabbing the figure's arm to prevent further movement. The man, panting and bloodied, was subdued under the K-9's powerful restraint. "You all right?" Ethan asked, his voice more urgent now. Max stood over the figure, growling low, not allowing them to make a move. His fur was damp with rain and blood, his eyes focused solely on the person beneath him. Ethan moved to grab his radio, his hand trembling slightly, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "Unit 12 to dispatch, we have a suspect down. Request backup at 9th and McKinley, possible assault with a weapon." "Copy, Unit 12, came the crackling response. "Backup is en route." Ethan didn't take his eyes off the suspect as he kneeled down beside him. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the cold night air. The man's hood had fallen back during the struggle, revealing a young face twisted in pain and fear. His eyes darted nervously, refusing to meet Ethan's gaze. The tension in the alley was palpable, every second dragging as the figure refused to answer. Max's growl deepened, and the suspect flinched, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan glanced at Max, then back to the suspect. "You better start talking, or things are going to get a lot worse for you." The man's lips trembled. I didn't want to hurt anyone. They told me to do it. I had no choice." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Who told you?" But the man remained silent, his head hanging in defeat. Before Ethan could press further, the unmistakable sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived. The streets were alive with the sound of approaching officers and flashing lights as 2 patrol cars pulled up to the scene. The backup officers quickly took control, handcuffing the suspect and moving him to their squad car. Ethan stood by, watching Max, who remained on high alert as if the situation was far from over. "Good work, Harper," one of the officers said as he approached. "Thanks," Ethan replied, though his gaze never left the suspect being loaded into the car. His mind raced with the uncertainty of what had just transpired. The man hadn't said much, and his reluctance to talk only raised more questions. Who was behind this, and why had they ordered him to attack? Max whined softly, drawing Ethan's attention. "I know, buddy. "We're not done yet." The K9's ears flicked in the direction of the old warehouse, a place that had been the focal point of gang activity recently. Ethan's gut twisted. He knew something wasn't right. The man in the alley hadn't been the mastermind. He was just a pawn. Whoever was pulling the strings remained in the shadows. Ethan turned to the officer who had spoken earlier. "I'm going to check out the warehouse," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "If anything looks off, we need to move fast." "Got it, Harper." "Be careful," the officer warned, but Ethan was already turning back to Max, who had begun pacing in circles. Max's alertness confirmed Ethan's suspicions. There was more to this than just a random attack. They were walking into something far bigger, something that could change the entire landscape of the city's criminal underworld. As he and Max moved toward the squad car, the rain began to fall heavier, the droplets mixing with the sweat and grime of the alley. The chill in the air cut through his uniform, but it wasn't the weather that made him uneasy. It was the gnawing feeling in his gut, the one he had learned to trust over the years. Something was coming, and it wouldn't be long before it found them. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and imposing against the backdrop of the city skyline. The once thriving building now stood as a crumbling monument to the city's troubled past. Its windows boarded up, its doors rusted shut. Perfect place to hide something or someone. Max's ears were pricked, his nose twitching with the scent of something amiss. Ethan's grip tightened around his flashlight as he approached the entrance. He checked the perimeter first, but there was no sign of movement. The area was still eerily so. Max was the first to react. The dog's tail stiffened, and he stood at attention, staring intently at the side of the building. Ethan followed his line of sight but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "What is it, Max?" he murmured, crouching beside him. Then, the faintest sound reached Ethan's ears, a soft shuffle, almost imperceptible, coming from inside the warehouse. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He motioned for Max to stay close, then pressed his back against the side of the building, making his way toward the sound. The closer they got, the more he could hear it, footsteps, faint but steady. There was someone inside. "Unit 12 to dispatch, we're going in." "Stand by," he said quietly into his radio, his voice barely audible. Max, always by his side, let out a low whine, and Ethan knew it was time to move. The two of them slipped inside through a side door, their footsteps muffled by the damp concrete floor. The smell of mildew and oil filled the air, but there was something else too. Something foul, something unnatural. Ethan's instincts flared as he and Max moved deeper into the warehouse, their surroundings growing darker with each step. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving quickly. "Freeze!" Ethan shouted, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But it was too late. A figure darted out from the shadows, faster than Ethan could react. The man was dressed in black, a mask obscuring his face, and in his hands he held a gun, a weapon trained straight at Ethan. "Down!" the man shouted, his voice cold and commanding. Max reacted instantly. Before the suspect could pull the trigger, the dog leaped forward, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's wrist. The gun fell to the ground with a sharp clatter. Ethan didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the suspect's other arm and forcing him to the ground, pinning him with all his weight. The warehouse was now alive with the sounds of struggle, but Max remained at Ethan's side, his teeth bared, ready to defend. "Don't move," Ethan warned, his weapon trained on the man as he struggled beneath him. The figure beneath him grunted in pain but stopped resisting. "This is over," Ethan said, though he knew deep down this was only the beginning. The rain continued to fall, the night growing colder, but Ethan felt no relief. He'd caught one of the people responsible for the attack, but he could still feel the presence of something darker, something far more dangerous, lurking just out of sight. As backup arrived and the suspect was taken into custody, Ethan's thoughts turned to the larger puzzle at hand. The pieces were scattered, but each new discovery was a step closer to unraveling the truth. Max sat at his side, his fur damp and eyes watchful, the silence between them heavy but reassuring. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The streets of the city were cloaked in darkness, save for the flickering streetlights casting harsh shadows along the cracked pavement. The wind had picked up, howling through the alleys, but Max, the K9 German Shepherd, paid it no mind. His eyes were locked on the path ahead, his body moving with a speed and agility that made him seem almost like a shadow, darting in and out of the darkness. Ethan had given him the signal to stay on the move, and Max obeyed without hesitation. The city was alive with danger, but to Max, this was just another night on patrol. His body seemed to glide over obstacles, leaping over trash cans, hurdling over broken curbs, and dodging the occasional speeding car that zipped past, its tires screeching as it passed. The world around him was a blur of lights, shadows, and noises, but Max's focus remained unwavering, his every sense honed in on the task at hand. The earlier altercation at the warehouse had left the air thick with tension. Ethan and Max had done their job, subduing the suspect, but Max's instincts told him that the situation was far from resolved. The scent of danger still lingered in the air, like the distant smell of smoke before a fire. There was something about the way the night had unfolded that didn't sit right with him. As they made their way down a narrow side street, Max's nose twitched. He could smell it. Something was wrong. A faint scent of unfamiliar cologne mixed with the stench of stale beer, the unmistakable smell of someone trying to cover their tracks. His ears flicked, narrowing in on a figure moving in the shadows, a figure that seemed out of place, like a predator waiting to strike. Max's pace quickened. He weaved between parked cars, his body fluid and purposeful. As he rounded a corner, his sharp eyes caught sight of Officer Jackson, another member of the police force who had been on a different part of the patrol. The officer was standing outside a convenience store, talking to a shopkeeper. Jackson's back was turned, his attention focused on the conversation at hand, completely unaware of the danger approaching. Max's body surged forward, muscles rippling under his fur as he closed the distance between himself and the officer. He wasn't going to wait for Ethan's signal. Something was wrong, and Max trusted his instincts. He was trained to protect, to serve, and tonight his duty wasn't done. With a low growl rumbling from deep within his chest, Max reached Jackson's side. He tugged at the officer's sleeve with his powerful jaws, pulling at it with enough force to make Jackson look down in surprise. "Hey, Max, what is it?" Jackson said, confused, but his tone quickly shifted as he saw the intensity in Max's eyes. Max's ears were flattened against his head, his gaze darting back down the street, toward the alley they had just passed. His tail was stiff, held high in warning. There was no time to waste. Max let out a sharp bark, a command, a plea. There was no mistaking it. Something was wrong, and it needed to be dealt with now. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the dog. "What is it, boy? What's going on?" he muttered, more to himself than to Max. But the tension in the air was palpable. Something shifted in Jackson's expression as he caught the subtle change in the atmosphere. He turned quickly to the shopkeeper, holding up a hand to signal that the conversation was over. "Sorry, gotta go," he said quickly, giving the man a hurried nod before turning to follow Max, who was already heading back down the street with purpose. Max's paws hit the pavement with a rhythmic thud, his powerful legs propelling him forward. He moved with confidence, but there was an urgency to his every step, an edge to his determination that Jackson couldn't ignore. The officer's breath came in short bursts as he followed, trying to keep up with Max's pace. But the K9's agility was unmatched. "Max, slow down," Jackson called, but the dog didn't respond, his focus locked on the task ahead. Jackson's mind raced. Something was happening, and Max knew it. The dog had never been wrong before, and Jackson wasn't about to doubt him now. He reached for his radio, tapping the button as he ran. "Unit 12 to dispatch, we're heading back to the scene. Something's wrong. I need backup." The crackle of the radio was the only answer for a moment, but soon, a voice responded. "Copy that, Unit 12. Backup on the way." As they neared the alley where they had earlier confronted the suspect, Max's pace slowed, his ears pricking up. He stopped at the entrance to the alley and sniffed the air, his body tense. Alert. Jackson pulled up beside him, scanning the area, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. The street was quiet, too quiet, but Jackson could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Max's nose twitched, and he started forward again, his body low to the ground, moving with the grace of a predator. Jackson followed close behind, his senses on high alert as they moved deeper into the alley. The air felt thick with the unknown, and Jackson's heart rate increased, each step heavier than the last. "Max," Jackson whispered, but the K9 didn't respond. His focus was fixed on something ahead, something just out of Jackson's view. The alley opened up into a small courtyard, the ground littered with debris and broken bottles. The faintest sound reached Jackson's ears, muffled voices, the soft scrape of shoes against gravel. The officer froze, his hand tightening around his weapon as he crouched behind a dumpster for cover. Max did the same, his body tense, waiting for the signal. Jackson's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but it was clear that whatever it wasn't good. Max's growl broke the silence, low and menacing. Jackson's eyes shot to the dog, who was now staring intently at the far side of the courtyard, where the voices seemed to be coming from. "Stay close, Max," Jackson whispered. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the echo of his boots on the ground barely audible over the rising hum of adrenaline in his veins. As he reached the edge of the dumpster, he peered around it, his eyes locking onto the scene unfolding before him. There were 3 men, all dressed in dark clothing, standing near a broken-down car. Their heads were down, and they were talking in hushed tones, the words too low for Jackson to make out. But there was something in the way they stood, the way they moved. They weren't just having a conversation, they were planning something. Max's growl grew louder, more insistent, and Jackson's eyes widened as he noticed one of the men reaching into his jacket. "Max, no," Jackson hissed under his breath, but it was too late. With a powerful lunge, Max darted out from behind the dumpster, his body moving like lightning as he closed the distance between himself and the men. The sound of his paws hitting the pavement was deafening in the stillness of the alley. "Get back," one of the men shouted, pulling out a weapon, but Max was too fast. He leaped, sinking his teeth into the man's arm with a growl that rattled the night air. The man screamed, dropping the gun as Max's jaws locked down, forcing him to the ground. Jackson was right behind him, his weapon drawn and aimed at the remaining 2 men, who froze in shock. "Don't move," Jackson ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The 2 men complied, their hands raised in surrender. Jackson moved quickly, his eyes scanning the area for any more threats. Max stood over the downed man, his teeth bared, his growls still vibrating in the air. The suspect, blood dripping from his arm, stared up at Jackson in fear. "Backup's on the way," Jackson said, panting slightly. He glanced down at Max, who was now looking up at him with those unwavering, intelligent eyes. "Good work, buddy," Jackson muttered, his hand gently resting on the K9's head. Max's body relaxed, but his eyes never left the men on the ground. He was still ready to act, still focused on protecting his partner. Jackson didn't take his eyes off the suspects as he keyed his radio again. "Unit 12 to dispatch. We have 3 suspects in custody. Request immediate backup and medical assistance. Copy that, Unit 12. Backup is on the way." As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency settle in his chest. This was just the beginning. Whatever these men were planning, whatever larger operation they were a part of, it wasn't over yet. Max stood by his side, calm but watchful, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. This was far from finished. The night had only just begun to reveal its secrets. The streets of the city were a labyrinth of shadows, twisted and dark. The glow of the streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, ghostly silhouettes across cracked pavement. There was an eerie stillness that hung in the air, as though the city itself was holding its breath. A cold wind swept through the narrow alleys, rustling debris and whispering through the abandoned buildings. But none of this fazed Max, the K9 German Shepherd, whose sharp eyes pierced the night. His muscles coiled like a spring, ready to move at a moment's notice. Max had been on the streets of this city countless times, but tonight was different. Tonight, there was a palpable tension in the air. The hairs along his back stood on end, and his nose twitched with every passing scent, alert to the slightest change in the environment. The lingering scent of a recent altercation at the warehouse still clung to the corners of the alleys, mixing with the distinct smells of decay and fear. Max's senses were on high alert, as he knew that danger had not yet passed. His partner, Officer Ethan Harper, sat at the wheel of their patrol car, eyes scanning the streets with practiced ease. But Max could feel the uncertainty radiating from the man beside him. Ethan was a seasoned officer, a man who had faced down danger countless times. Yet tonight, even his confidence wavered. He wasn't the only one who could sense something wrong in the air. Max's paws were pressed firmly against the floor of the car as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on the darkened streets ahead. His ears flicked at every sound, the distant sirens, the hum of a car's engine in the distance, and the occasional shout from someone in the alleyways. The city was alive with the pulse of urban life, but to Max, the world was different. He wasn't concerned with the usual hum of the city's activities. He was concerned with something far more pressing, something lurking in the shadows just beyond his reach. With a sharp breath, Max leaned forward in the seat, his nose twitching as he caught a scent that made his body tense. The faintest hint of cologne mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder and the unmistakable odor of fear. It was the scent of a man, a stranger, who didn't belong in these streets. And Max knew immediately that it was a scent he had to follow. Without a word, Max pushed himself out of the car, his body sleek and controlled, moving like a shadow. Ethan followed quickly, his hand already on the weapon at his side. They moved silently through the streets, side by side, Max in the lead, his powerful legs carrying him with unerring precision. Max's pace was steady, each step purposeful as he navigated the dark streets with ease. He dodged a pile of garbage with a swift leap, his body twisting gracefully through the air before landing silently on the pavement. He continued without slowing, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. He could feel it, the weight of the unknown pressing against him. As they approached an intersection, Max's gaze flicked to the left, where a car sped past, its engine roaring. Without hesitation, Max darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the car as it whizzed by. His body was a blur of motion as he expertly dodged the oncoming traffic, weaving between cars, and leaping over a cracked sidewalk. There was no time to waste. Every second counted. His breathing was steady, controlled, but his mind was sharp, attuned to every detail around him. His training had prepared him for moments like this, when danger lurked around every corner, when a single misstep could be the difference between life and death. Max's eyes darted back to the streets, and he caught sight of Officer Jackson, a fellow officer from a nearby precinct. Jackson was standing on the corner of a street, seemingly unaware of the approaching danger. Max's heart quickened, and without thinking, he sprinted toward him, his paws pounding the pavement with rhythmic precision. In a split second, Max was beside Jackson, his body tense with urgency. He tugged at the officer's sleeve with a forceful yank, his powerful jaws catching hold of the fabric. The sudden movement startled Jackson, who looked down in surprise, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "What is it, boy?" Jackson asked, his voice filled with confusion. But Max didn't wait for an answer. He barked once, loud and commanding, before pulling on Jackson's sleeve again, this time more urgently. Jackson's eyes widened as he glanced down at Max. He had seen the dog act before, but there was something in the air tonight that made him uneasy. He had been trained to trust his instincts, and right now, everything inside him screamed that something was terribly wrong. "Max, what's going on?" Jackson muttered under his breath. He knew the K9 was trying to communicate something important. Max didn't waste any time. He turned, his body low to the ground, and darted back down the street, pulling Jackson behind him with a relentless determination. The officer followed, his hand on his weapon, his senses on high alert. The urgency in Max's movements was unmistakable. The dog was leading him, guiding him, as though he knew exactly where they needed to go. Jackson's pulse quickened as he picked up his pace. His mind raced with questions. What was happening? What had Max sensed that he hadn't? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into a storm, one that was already brewing and ready to explode. As they rounded the corner and approached the alley where Max had first sensed danger, Jackson's grip on his weapon tightened. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like it brought them closer to something they couldn't yet see. Max's eyes flicked from side to side. His ears perked, every muscle in his body tensed and ready to spring into action. The alleyway loomed ahead, dark and narrow, its walls lined with debris. The distant sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Max's growl deepened, the sound vibrating in the air like a warning. Jackson slowed, his breath shallow as he moved closer to the entrance of the alley. Max was first to step inside, his body low to the ground, his senses sharp. Jackson followed, his steps quiet, his eyes scanning the shadows. The world seemed to shrink around them, the silence deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. The alley was empty, but Max's posture told a different story. He could feel the danger that hung in the air, thick and palpable. Jackson's eyes flicked over the scene, looking for anything that might give him a clue as to what Max had sensed. The alley appeared deserted, but his gut told him otherwise. He glanced down at Max, whose body was rigid, every muscle coiled as though waiting for the strike. Then it happened. A noise, a soft scuff of a boot against the concrete, echoed through the alley. Max's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing for action. Jackson's hand flew to his weapon, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal of the grip. He was ready. "Show yourself," Jackson barked, his voice authoritative, but tinged with the realization that they were no longer alone. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, slowly, cautiously. A man, his face obscured by a hood, his steps deliberate as he moved closer. The figure stopped just a few feet away, his posture relaxed, but the glint of something metallic in his hand made Jackson's blood run cold. Before Jackson could react, the man raised his arm, the unmistakable flash of a weapon catching the dim light. Max was already in motion, his body springing forward with a ferocity that only a trained K9 could possess. The dog lunged, his powerful jaws sinking into the man's arm with a force that made the figure cry out in pain. The man stumbled back, dropping his weapon as Max held him down with a growl that sent a chill through the alley. Jackson was right behind him, his weapon trained on the remaining figures that had been hiding in the shadows. There were more, 2 others, both moving quickly, but Jackson was ready. "Drop it!" Jackson shouted, his voice unwavering. He didn't hesitate as the 2 men froze, their hands rising in surrender. Max continued to hold the first man down, his teeth locked around the arm, his growls unwavering as he kept the suspect pinned. Jackson's eyes flicked to Max, who was still guarding his position, watching over his partner with unwavering loyalty. The dog's instincts had been spot on. He had sensed the danger before it even materialized. "Stay down," Jackson muttered, his eyes scanning the area for any other threats. He keyed his radio again, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Unit 12 to dispatch. We've apprehended 3 suspects. Request backup and medical assistance." As the sounds of sirens began to fill the air, Jackson turned back to Max, who had relaxed slightly but remained alert, his body still tense. The night was far from over, and Jackson knew it. But for now, at least they had done their job. Max had been right. The danger had been real, and they had stopped it, together. The night had descended into chaos in the blink of an eye. What had begun as a routine patrol had spiraled into a violent confrontation. In the blink of an eye, Officer Ethan Harper had found himself on the ground, bleeding heavily, with his life hanging in the balance. His partner, Max, the K9 German Shepherd, had leaped into action with a ferocity that only a trained working dog could muster, bringing down one assailant while Jackson had taken care of the rest. As the tension in the alley began to subside and the immediate threat was neutralized, Jackson rushed to Ethan's side, his hands already moving to assess the damage. His heart raced as he dropped to his knees beside his fellow officer, his gaze falling on the wound that had caused the blood to spread across the pavement. Ethan lay on his side, his face pale and etched with pain. The wound in his abdomen was deep, the blood seeping from the jagged edges of the gash, staining his uniform. His breathing was shallow, labored, but there was a faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes as they flicked toward Jackson. "Ethan," Jackson called urgently, his voice trembling with a mix of concern and professionalism. "Stay with me, all right? You're going to be fine. Just stay with me." Max stood a few feet away, his body tense, his eyes trained on the two men. He was clearly restless, his protective instincts still on high alert as he stood guard over his fallen partner. The K9's growl was low and threatening, a warning for anyone who dared to approach them. His eyes flicked from the motionless Ethan to the surrounding area, scanning the darkness for any sign of further threats. "Easy, Max," Jackson said, his voice calm, but firm. He knew how much the dog meant to Ethan, how much Ethan trusted Max. "It's just me. I'm not going anywhere. We'll get him help, all right? Just stay calm, buddy." Max's growl persisted for a few moments longer, but at Jackson's command, the dog's stance softened just slightly. His eyes never left Ethan, though. It was clear that he would not let anyone, no one, get close to the fallen officer unless they were deemed safe. Jackson's hands moved quickly as he applied pressure to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. Time was slipping away, and every second counted. Ethan's pulse was weak, his breathing shallow, but there was no time to waste. Jackson keyed his radio with trembling fingers, his voice low but steady despite the fear that threatened to overtake him. "Unit 12 to dispatch. Officer down. I need paramedics at my location, now. We have a gunshot wound, severe bleeding. We need immediate medical assistance." His voice echoed in the silence of the alley, the only other sound being Max's low growls and Ethan's labored breathing. Jackson felt a sense of urgency, but he kept his movements steady, trying to keep the panic at bay. He had seen injuries like this before, but never to someone so close to him. Not someone he had worked alongside for years. "Come on, Ethan," Jackson whispered, his eyes scanning the officer's pale face. "Stay with me. Help is on the way." Ethan's lips parted slightly, and Jackson held his breath as he leaned in closer. For a moment, he thought Ethan might speak, but instead, the officer's eyes fluttered, and his hand weakly reached out toward Max. Jackson watched as Max, ever vigilant, moved closer, his muzzle nudging Ethan's hand gently, as if reassuring his partner that he was there. Max's low whine echoed through the alley, filled with an emotion that Jackson could feel in the pit of his stomach. The dog's eyes were wide, his gaze locked onto Ethan, sensing his partner's pain and fear. "Good boy, Max," Jackson murmured, his hand brushing the dog's fur for a moment. "He's gonna make it. Just hang in there." But as Jackson looked back down at Ethan, he saw that the officer's eyes were closing. His body slumped against the pavement, his breathing becoming more erratic as the world around him seemed to fade. "No!" Jackson shouted, his voice cracking. His hand shot to Ethan's chest, applying more pressure to the wound, but it was too late. The officer's body went limp, his pulse barely detectable. Panic surged through Jackson's chest, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to lose his composure now. "Ethan! Ethan!" Jackson shouted, shaking the officer's shoulder. His fingers fumbled for his radio once again, his words barely intelligible as he tried to call for help. "Unit 12 to dispatch. Officer Harper. Harper is unconscious. He's losing a lot of blood. I need paramedics now." Max's growl deepened, a low, warning sound that seemed to reverberate in Jackson's chest. The K9 was still on high alert, unwilling to leave his partner's side even as Jackson struggled to stabilize Ethan. The seconds stretched out into what felt like eternity. Jackson was doing everything he could, but there was only so much he could do without proper medical equipment. Max was a constant presence at his side, growling low and occasionally moving closer to Ethan, his large body tense with a mixture of concern and protective instinct. Then, the sound of sirens broke through the tension. The faint wail of an approaching ambulance pierced the silence of the night, and Jackson felt a surge of relief. Help was on the way. But as the ambulance drew closer, Max's anxiety seemed to grow. The dog whined once more, his eyes locked on Ethan, who was still unconscious, his chest barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. The paramedics arrived in a blur, their faces serious as they moved quickly to assess Ethan's condition. Jackson stepped back, allowing them to work, but Max stayed close, his body tight with tension. The K9's eyes never left the officers as they worked to stabilize Ethan, and he continued to growl, his protective nature refusing to let anyone get too close without his approval. One of the paramedics, a woman with short, dark hair, glanced at Max and raised an eyebrow. "You've got a loyal one there," she said quietly, her voice filled with a sense of respect. "We're going to need you to step back, though, buddy. We've got to work fast." Max didn't budge. He stood his ground, his stance unyielding. His eyes flicked back to Jackson, seeking reassurance. Jackson could only nod, giving Max the silent permission to remain close. He knew the dog wasn't going to leave Ethan's side, no matter what. As the paramedics worked, Jackson's heart was in his throat. He could see the bloodstains on the pavement, feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His eyes stayed on Ethan, watching as the paramedics applied pressure to the wound and worked to stabilize the officer. The once pale face of his partner now seemed almost lifeless, his breathing still shallow and labored. Jackson kept his eyes locked on Ethan, his thoughts racing. Would he make it through this? Could they save him? The paramedics worked quickly, their movements precise and efficient as they readied Ethan for transport. Jackson stepped aside, his eyes never leaving the scene. He felt a hand on his shoulder, but it was only the second paramedic, the man with short blonde hair, offering him a brief nod. "He's going to be all right," the paramedic said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Jackson nodded but didn't speak. He couldn't shake the tightness in his chest, the fear that still clung to him like a second skin. He had seen too many close calls in his career, but this one felt different. Max's body stiffened, and Jackson's attention snapped back to the dog, who was now pacing back and forth, his low whines growing more intense. As the paramedics lifted Ethan onto the stretcher, Max stood by, his eyes locked on the injured officer with a look of pure distress. The stretcher was loaded into the back of the ambulance, and Jackson climbed in after them, his eyes never leaving his partner. Max, still as protective as ever, followed close behind, but when he reached the ambulance doors, he stopped, unwilling to let his partner out of his sight. "Come on, Max," Jackson murmured, motioning for the dog to come inside. But Max only whined again, refusing to move. He was torn, unwilling to leave Ethan alone, even for a moment. "I'll stay with him," Jackson promised. "We're taking care of him. Don't worry." With a final, reluctant glance at Ethan, Max gave a soft whimper before turning away, his eyes filled with longing. He didn't want to leave his partner's side, but he knew that Jackson was there. He trusted Jackson. As the doors of the ambulance closed, the engine roared to life, and the sirens wailed again, cutting through the night. Jackson's hand rested on Ethan's shoulder, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. They had survived the worst of it. Now all they could do was hope. Max remained outside, standing watch over the ambulance, a silent sentinel in the night. He would not leave until he knew his partner was safe. The sterile, quiet halls of the hospital felt like a world apart from the chaos of the night. Outside, the world had moved on. The police sirens had faded into the distance, and the streets once bustling with the energy of the city now lay still, dark and empty. Inside the hospital, however, time seemed to move at its own slow pace, one agonizing minute at a time. Officer Ethan Harper lay unconscious in a bed, hooked to machines that beeped rhythmically, keeping track of his fading pulse. The wound on his abdomen had been stabilized, and though the surgeons had worked tirelessly to repair the damage, there was no guarantee that he would survive the night. The bullet had come too close to his vital organs, and even now the doctors could only watch and wait, hoping that the strength of his body and the strength of his spirit would pull him through. Beside his bed, a K9 German Shepherd named Max lay sprawled on the floor, his body tense, his eyes never leaving Ethan. The dog's large frame was still, but his sharp eyes scanned the room, constantly alert. Nurses and doctors had tried several times to coax Max away, telling him it wasn't safe to stay so close to the bed, but the dog refused to leave his partner's side. His ears were flat against his head, his gaze fixed intently on Ethan, as if daring anyone to make him move. "He won't budge," one of the nurses said, frustration creeping into her voice. "We've tried everything." The head doctor, Dr. Thomas, stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. He was a man used to handling high-stress situations, but even he seemed a little unnerved by the dog's unyielding presence. "This isn't good. We need to get him to eat, to rest, to—" Max let out a low, rumbling growl, his lips curling back ever so slightly. It wasn't aggressive, but it was clear that he was unwilling to leave Ethan's side under any circumstances. The doctor took a cautious step back. All right, Dr. Thomas muttered under his breath. "Let's see what we can do to keep the dog calm while we monitor Ethan." But even as the doctor turned away, Max stayed where he was, his eyes locked on Ethan. No amount of coaxing would make the dog move, and deep down, everyone in the room knew that Max wasn't going anywhere. Not until his partner was awake. Not until he knew that Ethan was safe. Flashbacks of their time together flooded Max's mind, memories rushing in like waves. They had been through so much together, more than either of them cared to count. Max had come into Ethan's life when he was still a rookie officer, eager to prove himself, to make a difference. Back then, he had no idea how much of a difference this dog would make. The training had been grueling. Max was smart, incredibly intelligent, but that didn't mean he didn't have his moments of stubbornness. They spent countless hours together, working through basic commands, scent tracking, agility drills, and tactical exercises. Max had learned to read Ethan's body language, to anticipate his commands even before they were spoken. And Ethan had learned to trust Max, to rely on him completely in high-stress situations. Max had always been there. He had been there when Ethan had faced danger head-on, when the odds had been stacked against him. He had been there in the quiet moments too, sitting by his side after a long day, offering silent comfort without ever needing to say a word. Their bond was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced, and it was clear to anyone who looked at them that they were partners in every sense of the word. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. And now, in the sterile silence of the hospital room, Max continued his vigil. His large, brown eyes were full of worry, but there was also a deep, unwavering determination in them. He wasn't going to leave until he knew that Ethan was okay. He had saved Ethan's life once already, and he wasn't going to abandon him now. Ethan's fight to regain consciousness was slow and painful. His head throbbed, and every inch of his body ached. But somewhere deep within him, he could feel the pull to return. He could feel Max's presence, his constant companion, and that was enough to keep him going. As his mind began to stir, memories of the events leading up to this moment flickered like fragments of a dream. He remembered the alley, the sudden pain, the blinding shock of the gunshot. He remembered the feeling of falling, of losing control. But then, in the haze of his mind, he felt something else. A tug, a warmth. Max, his partner, the dog who had never left his side. In the darkness of his mind, he reached out for that connection, willing himself to return. He fought through the fog of unconsciousness, driven by the memory of Max's bark, the feel of the dog's fur against his hand. Slowly, painfully, he began to pull himself back into the world of the living. Outside the room, Jackson stood in the hallway, pacing. His eyes were tired, and his body ached from the events of the night. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving him with a deep sense of exhaustion. Still, he couldn't bring himself to rest. Not while Ethan was fighting for his life. Jackson had seen a lot in his career, but watching his partner go down like that had shaken him to the core. He wasn't sure how much time had passed since they had arrived at the hospital, but it felt like an eternity. Every second had dragged by in a cruel, unrelenting stretch of silence. He had stayed in the waiting area for a while, but it hadn't taken long for him to find his way back to Ethan's room. He couldn't be away from his friend, his partner, not when he needed him most. As he stood at the door, he could hear the soft sound of Max's low growl. He pushed the door open slowly, his eyes immediately locking onto the dog lying beside Ethan's bed. Max didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence, but Jackson knew he was there, alert, watchful, unwavering. Jackson stepped inside the room and approached the bed, his eyes falling on Ethan's still form. The officer's face was pale, and the machines beeped softly, tracking the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. The blood loss had been severe, and though they had done everything they could, there was no certainty. "Ethan," Jackson whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Come on, buddy. Don't do this to me. Don't leave me hanging." For a moment, it seemed like Ethan's body would remain still. But then, ever so slowly, his eyelids fluttered. A faint groan escaped his lips, and Jackson's breath caught in his chest. He leaned closer, his heart pounding. "Ethan," Jackson said again, his voice softer now, full of relief and hope. "You with me?" There was a long pause, and then, at last, Ethan's eyes opened, blinking as if trying to adjust to the light. His vision was blurry at first, but soon he was able to make out the familiar shapes in the room. Jackson, the machines, and finally, the most important figure in his life, Max. Max's eyes were wide, full of concern, but also filled with something more: love, loyalty, and an unwavering devotion. The dog's tail thumped gently against the floor as he took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "Max," Ethan whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. His hand moved weakly toward the dog, and Max immediately nudged his palm with his snout, as if offering silent reassurance. Jackson stepped back, giving the two of them a moment. There were no words needed. The bond between them spoke louder than anything either of them could say. Finally, Jackson cleared his throat and broke the silence. "You're gonna be all right, Harper," he said, his voice rough. "Max saved your life. You know that?" Ethan nodded weakly, a faint smile crossing his lips as he tried to sit up. "I know," he said, his voice still strained. "He's always been there." Max whined softly, his head tilting in that way only a dog could manage when he was seeking comfort. Ethan's eyes softened as he looked at his partner, a look of pure gratitude in his gaze. "You're a damn hero, Max," he whispered. Jackson smiled at the exchange, relief flooding through him. "We all are, Harper. We all are." In that moment, there was nothing more to be said. The three of them, Ethan, Jackson, and Max, were connected in ways that words could never fully describe. They had faced death together, and they had come out the other side. And for now, that was enough. Max let out a quiet bark, as if agreeing with everything that had been said. Ethan smiled and reached out to give the dog's head a gentle pat, still trying to steady himself after everything that had happened. It was the first real moment of peace they had all shared since the night had turned dark, and it felt like the beginning of a long road to recovery. "Thanks, Max," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. The dog's tail wagged slowly in response, and as Jackson watched, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for both his partners. They had made it through, together, and now they would heal together, too. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital's sterile white walls became a distant memory for Officer Ethan Harper. The journey to recovery had been long and painful, but each passing day brought a little more strength back to his body, and with it, a sense of hope. Max, his steadfast K9 partner, had never left his side. The bond between them had only deepened as they endured each step of Ethan's physical and emotional healing. At first, the pain had been unbearable. The bullet wound that had torn through Ethan's abdomen had left a mark, both on his body and his soul. Every movement was a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. The night of the shooting played over in his mind constantly, the sound of the gunshot, the feeling of the blood seeping from his body, and the vision of Max lunging toward the assailant. All of it replayed like a film that wouldn't stop. But there was also something else. Max's determined, unrelenting presence. Even in the hospital, when Ethan had been too weak to move, Max had been there, curled up at the foot of his bed, refusing to leave. The doctors had been surprised by how quickly Ethan's condition had improved, and though they attributed it to the medical care he had received, Ethan knew it was something more. Max had been a lifeline in those dark hours, a constant reminder of the strength that existed outside of himself. By the time Ethan was cleared to return to the precinct, he had regained enough strength to walk on his own, though he was still far from 100%. His movements were slower, more deliberate, but the fire inside him burned just as bright. Max, as always, remained vigilant. His watchful eyes never strayed far from his partner, and even as they moved through the bustling hospital corridors toward the exit, Max's posture was that of a guardian, a protector. The precinct had never looked more welcoming. As Ethan and Max approached the front doors, they were met with the sight of his fellow officers lined up, their expressions full of respect and admiration. The camaraderie that existed among them had always been strong, but now, in the wake of everything that had happened, it was stronger than ever. Ethan stepped into the building, and the room fell silent for a moment. Then, as if on cue, the officers broke into applause. Their hands came together in a thunderous show of support, and Ethan couldn't help but smile, his heart swelling with gratitude. Max, as always, remained at his side, tail wagging in approval as if he understood the significance of the moment. Captain Doyle, a no-nonsense leader with a deep respect for the job and the officers under his command, stepped forward. His expression was solemn, but his eyes twinkled with pride as he approached Ethan and Max. "I'm sure I don't need to say this, Harper," Captain Doyle began, his voice resonating through the room, "but it's good to have you back." Ethan chuckled softly, wincing slightly as he shifted his weight. "Good to be back, sir," he replied, though his voice was thick with emotion. But the captain wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Max, who was standing stoically at Ethan's side, his eyes never leaving the captain. As for Max, Captain Doyle continued, "I don't think there's a single person here who doesn't know what this dog did for us. Max is a hero, pure and simple. And today we recognize that heroism." The captain motioned to Officer Jackson, who stepped forward with a small, velvet box in his hands. Inside, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, was a medal for bravery, one that had been reserved for those who had displayed extraordinary courage in the face of danger. "Max," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion, "for your unwavering loyalty, your courage, and your incredible actions in saving Officer Harper's life, I'm proud to present you with this medal. You are, without a doubt, the bravest of us all." The room was silent for a moment as Jackson carefully placed the medal around Max's neck. The K9 stood tall, unbothered by the ceremony, but there was a glint in his eyes that spoke volumes. To anyone who had witnessed his actions that night, it was clear that the dog didn't need a medal to prove his worth. He had already earned that distinction 100 times over. Ethan placed a hand on Max's head, his voice filled with emotion. "You saved my life, buddy," he said softly, his words barely above a whisper. "You didn't just save my life. You saved all of us." Max's tail wagged slowly, and for the first time in a while, Ethan felt a sense of peace. The storm that had raged inside him for so long, the fear, the guilt, the uncertainty, began to settle, and he realized something that had always been true, but that he had never fully understood until now. Max wasn't just a dog. He wasn't just a partner. Max was his protector, his hero, his family. And no matter what came next, Ethan knew that they would face it together. That was their bond. That was their unspoken promise. Captain Doyle's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "Harper, Max," the captain said, "we're all proud of you. We've all been through a lot these past few weeks, but it's moments like this that remind us why we do what we do. You two, he pointed to Max and then to Ethan, embody everything that this department stands for. Bravery, loyalty, honor. Thank you for reminding us all of that. The officers erupted into applause again, and this time, Ethan felt it in his heart. The support, the admiration, the sense of camaraderie. It was a bond that transcended rank, a bond that could never be broken. And in that moment, as Max stood at his side, Ethan knew that no matter the challenges ahead, they would face them together, as they always had. Later that night, after the ceremony had ended and the precinct had settled back into its usual rhythm, Ethan found himself alone in the quiet of his office. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws as he watched his partner work. The weight of the day had caught up with Ethan, and his body ached from the effort of pretending that he wasn't exhausted. But there was something comforting in the silence, something reassuring in the presence of Max. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo on his desk, the one of him and Max, taken during their first day on the job together. The photo was old now, yellowed at the edges, but it held a special place in his heart. It reminded him of how far they had come, of the long road they had traveled side by side. You know, buddy, Ethan said softly, looking down at Max, I never really understood what it meant to have a partner like you. Not until now. Max's tail thumped once, and he lifted his head, locking eyes with Ethan. It was as if he understood exactly what his partner was saying. You're not just my partner, Max, Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion. You're a hero. You're my protector. And I'm damn lucky to have you by my side. Max let out a soft woof, as if to acknowledge Ethan's words. Then, as if satisfied, he lay his head back down and closed his eyes. Ethan smiled, his heart full of gratitude. They had been through so much together, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was certain. They would face it together. Whatever came next, Max would be there, and Ethan would be right beside him. And in that moment, Ethan knew, more than ever, that no matter what the future held, he and Max would always have each other. And that was all they needed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves inspiring dog stories, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible tales of loyalty and courage. Stay tuned.